Welcome to this bonus anthology of 4 droll sci-fi short stories. I'll be narrating Is That You, Xeluchli by Dick Hetschel, Farewell Message by David Mason, Firegod by Algis Budrys, and The Mightiest Man by Patrick Fahy. You can get more stories like these over on my Substack, linked in the description. Everything there is ad-free in video, audio and podcast form. So if you'd like more narrations not on YouTube, go check that out. But for now, let's get to the stories. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Is That You, Xeluchli? By Dick Hetschel. Narrated by William Skye. Orena and Xeluchli meant well. But had they obeyed the rules, had they remained bodiless observers, they would have saved BUP, that .02 F*, a hellacious catastrophe. It was a perfectly conventional tour, once around the Milky Way with stops at several of the major stars. It was supposed to take about 88 million years, so they planned to be back for supper. In the beginning, the students had remained in a fairly close knot around Mundo Kaftahiti, their instructor, but as the tour progressed, some of the more venturesome strayed further and further from the rest of the class. Dro Orena and Dro Xeluchli had wandered a greater distance than usual from the crowd and were jamming experimental thought webs into a large space vortex when Xeluchli signalled to Orena to tune her mind off the lecture frequency. It was against the rules, of course, but then Orena supposed Xeluchli would take the blame for her if they were caught, so she switched over to the conversational band. "Want to have some fun?" asked Xeluchli. Orena continued to stare into the space vortex. "How?" she asked. Xeluchli waved a visible thought fragment in a circle about him. "The stars," he said. "Let's explore a little on our own. They never hit the really good spots on these tours." Orena had been thinking for a long time of doing that very thing, so she hardly argued at all before letting Xeluchli convince her. "We'll be gone only a little while, and they'll never miss us," said Xeluchli as they headed for a nearby star cluster. Everything would have been all right if they had obeyed the rules. "Hands off the planet," the rules said, and that was really a reasonable and intelligent demand. In all fairness to them, it must be admitted that Orena and Xeluchli had no intention of breaking that rule when they strayed away from the rest of the crowd. They found this little planet which was listed in the textbook as BUP, an 0.2 F* with 9 planets. By a lucky chance, they were just in time to see a transient little civilization spring into being on its 3rd planet. This was too wonderful a chance to miss, so they decided to stay a few 100,000 years and see how it would end. They would catch up with the rest of the tour afterward. The creatures entering into civilization were bipeds, and of a physical appearance rather low on the aesthetic scale, but Orena and Xeluchli soon discovered that they were bisexual. This pleased them very much, and made them feel that they had something in common with this little civilization, for Orena and Xeluchli were bisexuals too, and bisexual civilizations were rare. Orena and Xeluchli had, in fact, been the only bisexuals in the touring group, which had been composed mostly of the slow-moving amoeboids from Procyon, and the emotionally unstable pentasexuals from Antares. It was a land civilization which they had found, and, just as the textbook said, it was having its beginning in the river deltas of the continents. The bipeds were both herbivorous and carnivorous, and the duration and bloodiness of their early wars was almost exactly as predicted by Globnung's food war formula. The speed of advance of the civilization was a little slow, but still comfortably within the lower limits of the Atati equation. Everything went well for the first 5,000 years, but then Aurena and Xeluchli began to catch signs of Gibrate's anachronism. They watched anxiously for a while, and soon they saw that their fears had been justified. Sociological advance had fallen so far behind technological advance that the law of socio-martial flux had been brought into play. The little civilization would almost certainly die a premature death. Aurena and Xeluchli watched the invention of greater and greater weapons and the hopeless retardation of the social system, and were saddened. They had hoped to watch a real civilization, and this one was not even going to go past the one-planet stage. They did not see how it could last half a century more. "And they're bisexuals too," said Xeluchli. "It's a shame. I wish we could do something." "Yes, but you know what the rules are," reminded Aurena. "We can only watch. We can't help them." "I know," said Xeluchli a little crossly. "A bunch of polysexuals and sixth-degree intellectuals make rules and we're supposed to obey them. You know, I'm tempted to interfere. No one would know." Aurena objected, but she was really in favour of violating the rule too, and after a while she let Xeluchli have his way. "We'll start the civilization over," he suggested. "It was low in some qualities at the very start, but if we begin it over again with 2 above-average specimens, I'm sure it will turn out better this time." "We'll save one of each sex and destroy the rest of the race," agreed Aurena. "It will be just like one of the controlled experiments in the laboratories of Arcturus 7, but on an even larger scale. Oh, this will be interesting." "We'll go down to the planets ourselves," said Xeluchli, "and pick the 2 creatures we'll use. We'll guide them and their descendants for a while until we're sure they'll turn out all right." They had been heading down toward the planet, and now they landed on a mountain top. "Shall we stay together?" asked Aurena. "No. Let's each of us observe the creatures separately at close range for a while. Then, after we've seen enough to make a good choice, we'll pick 2 of them and destroy the rest." "We'll each pick 1, suggested Aurena. "You pick the female, and I'll pick the male." Xeluchli agreed and added, "When you've found him, enclose him in a bubble of mental protection and turn your mind to wavelength OEC. I'll turn my mind to wavelength HHW when I have a female protected, and the combination of these waves, each harmless by itself, will result in a .0008W wave which will destroy the rest of the race. Afterward, we'll meet on this hill." There was a city at the foot of the mountains, and Aurena headed there. She intermingled her atoms with those of a building for a while, and watched from one of its inner walls, trying to get some idea of the habits of the bipeds. At first she was puzzled by the fact that only one sex of the creatures entered the room she was watching. After a while, though, she began to suspect its true nature. She was learning little here, so she went out into the streets of the city where she could observe all phases of life. At first she assumed a shape that the bipeds could not see, but after a while she decided that she could best accomplish her purpose in the guise of one of the bipeds themselves. She turned herself into a female of the species and began in earnest her search for a desirable male. She found that the society was very primitive in most respects, and that it was not at all difficult to integrate herself into it. This was a new experience for her, and one of the most thrilling things that had ever happened to her. One by one she dropped the use of senses and mental ranges not possessed by the bipeds to make the game more exciting. Soon, her senses and thoughts were operating on a level hardly above that of the creatures themselves. She often found herself wishing that she had paid more attention to her classes in the lower civilizations, so she could better understand the things she was seeing. She was in no hurry to bring this adventure to an end, so for several weeks she investigated male after male, looking for one with a high socio-kinetic rating and a low or average technokinetic rating. It was about 30 days later that she made her decision. She had been talking to a young male biped in a bookstore when she realized that he would do at least as well as any she had come across so far. She found that his name was Adam Hennessy, and she proceeded to sound him out a little further. "And literature, then?" she asked, picking up a book from one of the tables. "Wouldn't you say that great literature should be placed above science?" "Yes," Adam agreed. "The material is emphasized too strongly at present. We must pay more attention to the spiritual." He adjusted his eye lenses. "I believe that is one of the major troubles of civilization." He tapped the ashes from his cigarette and looked at her for confirmation. "Hell yes," she agreed heartily. "We are concentrating on the means and forgetting the ends." "We are concentrating on the transient," he echoed, "and forgetting the eternal." This bit of conversation was enough to convince the somewhat satiated Orenna. She cast a web of mental protection over the biped and set her mind to an OEI wavelength. Obviously, Xeluchli had already made his choice and set his mind to the HHW wavelength, for all the bipeds she could see, except the protected Adam Hennessy, immediately fell to the ground and lay still. The effect was odd and uncheerful. Now came one of the most interesting games she had played in her stay on the planet. She tried to match the biped's state of bewilderment and terror with one of her own, and at the same time lead him to the top of the mountain. She could, of course, have transported him, protective web and all, to the mountain top in a split second, but that would have seemed like cheating at the game. The web protecting Adam Hennessy was invisible to his eyes, and Orenna continued to play the part of a fellow biped. In his confused state, it was not difficult to lead Adam up the mountain by little suggestions, or often by merely taking the first step. She suggested that from the mountain top they could see better what had happened and whether anyone else was alive. He even added the idea that they might get out of the area of contamination or whatever it was by climbing. "Heavy gases stay low," he said, assuming apparently that another war had been declared. They were the first to reach the top. Xeluchli and his find were not yet in sight. Orenna kept up her act while they waited. She and Adam Hennessy searched out over the valleys below and chattered worried ideas at each other. Orenna was secretly watching for Xeluchli whenever she looked down the mountain, but soon the sun set and the light faded. It was very dark in the valleys, and she did not wish to use any but biped eyes in the presence of Adam Hennessy, at least not until Xeluchli arrived, so she gave up looking. As time went by, she began to get worried. It was cold on the mountain, and she grew impatient to change to some other form. She searched the valleys below again, but not even a light of the dead city was visible. The biped was growing nervous, and she was not sure how much longer she could keep him here. He was standing sheltered by a crag of rock and gazing out into the dark spaces where the city had been, and for a long while Orenna stood near him and looked far out into the valleys to the left. Time passed, and finally the sun began to rise, and she grew more worried than ever. A terrible thought hit her, and she shivered. She stole glances at Adam Hennessy from time to time, and she noticed that he was glancing queerly at her now and then. This continued for some time. Finally, she could stand it no longer. She turned to him and asked, "Heavens, is that you, Xeluchli?" She really did not need an answer. Farewell Message by David Mason. Narrated by William Skye. The goo found Earth primitive and crude. Its hydrogen bombs, for instance. There was the alien spaceship. It squatted in the middle of the airfield's main runway, in the way of every plane landing and taking off, to the complete confusion of traffic control. The airport people had asked the goo politely to move it. He had looked at them with blank indifference and gone on making notes on Terran marriage rights. Nobody had suggested forcing the goo to move his ship. The ship looked as heavy as a battle cruiser, it was probably armed, and it did not look as if it could be moved by anything short of a hydrogen bomb. The goo, when told about hydrogen bombs, had smiled and implied that such weapons were about on par with stone axes. The governments of the world treated the goo with respect, and informed their peoples that he was merely a visiting student with no intention of harming them, and should be given every courtesy according to the best traditions of hospitality to strangers. So far he had not become angry at anyone. It was not too difficult to be courteous to the goo. He looked reasonably pleasant, the standard number of arms and legs, one head, and only a slight tint of green to the skin. The green tint had caused one restaurant in the southern United States some debate before they would permit him a table, but the goo had not been angered. He had merely smiled and noted it down in his notes about taboos. In fact, the only thing that made it slightly difficult to be courteous to the goo was his air of superiority. He paid for services and sample objects and information by trading strange gadgets which could do fabulous things and which were immediately patentable by the lucky owners, but he passed out the priceless gadgets with the air of a civilized man handing out glass beads and useless gimcracks to savages. It was a question how long before someone felt enough insulted by this air of superiority to lose his temper and kill the alien being. The governments of the world were nervously protective of the goo, trying to postpone and prevent any such murder. They were afraid of a space fleet or police force that might come to inquire what had happened to him if he came to harm. At last, to the relief of governments and to the joy of the traffic control department of the airport where his ship still obstructed traffic, the goo was about to go home. His ship was filled with photographs, notes, and souvenirs. He announced that he had spent enough years in a tour of strange planets to complete his course of study. He announced a farewell speech. Photographers brought cameras to focus on him standing on the lowered gangplank of his ship, and colour TV projected his image to the screens of the world, a tallish person, only a little strange and ugly, with a smooth greenish tint to his skin. The photographers finished flashing stills, and the TV sound booms moved in to pick up his voice. The oldest reporter there was named McCann, and experience had made him leathery and cynical. He already knew what the goo would say. The alien's superior attitude had made it only too clear. Someone reminded the goo respectfully that he had promised a speech. "Yes, indeed," he replied sonorously. His English was perfect. He had spent all of 3 hours in learning to speak it. "You may write in your history books that I think Earth is a pleasant little planet," he went on, "but sadly backward and primitive in many respects. I believe that this is caused by the numerous wars and the generally quarrelsome behaviour of your species." He said this without anger, and looked at the crowd and the cameras with a kind of superior pity and compassion in his gaze. "If you could only stop this bickering among yourselves, with a planet as green and pleasant as this, you could attain a harmony and pleasure of life equal to any of the truly civilized worlds of the galaxy. My home world, for example, abolished wars generations ago. We learned a philosophy of cooperation." He paused and gestured up dramatically at the starry night sky, and again looked at the crowd with contempt. "Yes, there are many worlds out there which are peaceful, productive, and cooperative. But there are also worlds which are dead and shrunken cinders where there had been green planets and thriving races of people who could not give up war. For your sake, I hope that you will be able to change your path, but I think that you do not have the ability, and that at last you will reach the end of the path you are on and destroy each other and perhaps your world also. Each nova that you see in the sky marks the suicide of a race. Our knowledge of these matters is certain. There is never a nova caused simply by accident. Power sources cannot fail this way. Each nova tells us of a war, of the death of a culture which probably thought of itself as civilized and yet could not subdue its innate savagery. The reporters scribbled and the cameras whirred. McCann closed his notepad, bored, and gazed at the sky, prepared to suffer through the rest of the speech. His paper could get the words of the speech from the TV. McCann had no comment to add. He had heard such ideas before. To the east, in the sky, was a distant glare of the landing lights of an oncoming aircraft. No, not a plane, a star. A star almost fantastically brilliant, brighter than the others, brighter than Mars. "Mr. Vigou," a young reporter said excitedly, "isn't that a nova there?" He pointed and everyone looked. Vigou turned, his hand on the gangway rail. They waited and fidgeted as he stood without moving, looking up. After a long enough time for him to have memorized the entire star region, his eyes came down again, and he looked at them blankly, as if he had forgotten why they were there. McCann felt a sudden electric thrill of recognition. He had seen a similar paralyzed lack of expression on the faces of men who had just learned that they had made some terrible mistake. He turned abruptly and pushed through the crowd, heading for a phone. The other reporters didn't understand. Not yet. "This nova," one of them said. "What was it from?" Vigou looked up at it. "A sun blew up," he muttered. 5 years ago. The light took 5 years to get here." The microphones barely picked up his voice. "Do you know anything about the people who lived there, Mr. Vigou?" Vigou opened his mouth as if to answer. Then he closed it again. He looked over his shoulder into his spaceship's entrance. A reporter asked, "What about the nova, Mr. Vigou?" I was very well acquainted with the people who caused it," Vigou said slowly. "Very well acquainted. I cannot imagine why it happened." "It was a war, wasn't it, Mr. Vigou?" "A war?" Vigou looked up again and hesitated. "Yes, I suppose it was." A moment later, he added, apparently without reason, "I've been away from home a long time." "How long will it take you to get back home, Mr. Vigou?" "Get back?" Vigou looked around vaguely, his shoulders slumped. He looked less alien somehow, and more like the men around him, and more likeable. He looked back to his questioner. Oh yes, I've changed my mind. You may tell your papers that I've decided to extend my stay with you. For some time, I think." The youngest reporter asked suddenly, "Did the nova have anything to do with you changing your mind? With this decision, I mean?" The tall, greenish man in the odd clothes came down the gangplank and entered the crowd, peering about as if he had forgotten the microphones and the cameras he was supposed to be speaking to. Then he saw his object and went through the crowd to him. It was an airfield official. "Sir," said Vagu to the official humbly, and suddenly everyone watching knew how well Vagu had known the people of the Nova world. "Sir, I believe this spaceship is in your way. Where would you like me to park it?" If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button. It helps this channel grow. Thanks. Firegod by Algis Budrys, writing as William Scarf. Narrated by William Sky. Some are born to greatness. Others achieve the rulership of systems. But Mersu wanted to be a god. All he needed was 1,000,000 years and a little luck. "Your Majesty!" Fahy Mersu, Emperor of all the suns, protector of the galaxy, looked up calmly as his Prime Minister burst into the room. His lean, brooding face did not change expression as he watched the pale and perspiring man cross the flagstone floor with a sharp, nervous patter of leather. "Gently, Tors, gently," he said quietly, his eyes mocking under their overhang of dark eyebrow. "You're Prime Minister now, remember that. A Prime Minister doesn't come blundering into the palace looking as though the sky was falling. It creates unrest in the population. Try to remember that we're no longer a pair of obscure rabble-rousers trying to overthrow the crown. We are the crown now. Try to act like it." "Fahy, the sky is falling," Tors burst out unheedingly. "I have word that the Earthmen are driving beyond the rim and into the heart of the Empire itself. Their ships are irresistible. They're winning battle after battle. And the people are restless. They say it's time the false Emperor's rule was overthrown. Some of the garrisons are rebelling." Still, the Emperor's expression did not change. "So," he said calmly, "the Earthmen were not bluffing when they said they'd maintain the rights of the old Emperor." "Yes, you said they wouldn't, Fahy. What are we going to do?" "I was wrong, Tors," Mersu said evenly. "No matter. As for what we are going to do, why, I suppose you'd better arrange for another broadcast. Tell the people we have weapons ready if the situation becomes serious, that they have nothing to fear." "But the situation is serious. And what weapons?" "No weapons, Tors," Mersu explained patiently. "But the story will serve to keep the people calm and perhaps make them think twice about revolt. Now go. Hurry!" The Prime Minister's feet pattered over the floor again. The door to the room closed. Mersu smiled quietly. He rose and opened the concealed door behind his chair. Closing it behind him, he slipped into a passage of which no one knew, and 10 minutes later he was in a private tubeway that led halfway across the continent into the heart of an old and barren mountain range. As he sat comfortably in the padded upholstery of the tube car, Mersu smiled again. Poor Tors. So excitable. Always the hysteric. A perfect rabble-rouser, perhaps, but not a clever man. No, never a clever man. A clever man knew when the game was over. And Mersu laughed. The game had been worth it. 5 years ago he had been a revolutionary slinking through the alleys at night, always in danger and always clever. 4 years of that, and then Empire. Absolute rule over the entire Greater Magellanic Cloud. Now he was once again in danger. But it was a danger he had long ago foreseen and planned for. And the past year had been worth it. He laughed again. Poor addle-witted Tors, left with the empty bag in his hands. The spaceship rested like a crouching bullet in its chamber. As he slid the tubeway door shut behind him, Mersu admired the savage sleekness of its lines once again. Even more, he admired his cleverness in having it built. A clever man always has a back door. He crossed the hangar floor unhurriedly and climbed into the ship. The control room was small but efficient. 100 controls lay closely around the padded chair, some of them for the standard drive, others for the hyperspatial warp. The hyperspatial warp, Mersu smiled. There was his escape, and more. Here were the means for his future rulership over nothing so small as the cloud. Here were entire galaxies waiting for his hand. Hyperspace. There was something to make a man think. Another universe, not beyond, but alongside his own, hidden in the complex byways of Riemannian geometry and the mathematics of Einstein. A universe where time itself ran slower, where a year of normal time encompassed centuries. A ship could twist itself into that universe and travel just below the speed of light, the limit which in normal space was the barrier no ship could cross. But in hyperspace, while the same barrier existed, a man from normal space could travel for centuries, covering great distances, while for him only a few months passed. Mersu chuckled. Behind him, stored in the great holds of the ship, were working models of every machine and weapon the cloud civilization possessed. There were plans, manuals, instructions, all translated into basic symbology that any intelligent being could understand. Packed into this ship was an entire civilization, ready to be brought to whatever people Mersu chose. He had only to enter hyperspace and lose himself where no Earthman or rebel could follow, and there he would find a primitive race barely beginning to rise out of the mud. He would bring them civilization. In return, he would have godhood. They would worship him, those primitive people. He would be Mersu the Firegod, thundering out of the sky, bringing with him the gift of civilization. And once the gift was given, he would climb back into the sky on a pillar of fire, promising to return when his people were ready. He laughed aloud, the deep bass sound echoing through the control chamber. Why not? He could fly back into space and spend a year waiting while centuries passed on the primitive world. When he returned, that world would be his, and soon afterward the entire universe would bow before the name of Mersu, the immortal Firegod, for there is no force so strong, no loyalty so great as that of men for their gods. Still laughing, he blasted the ship out of its hangar into the darkness of space, and a little later into hyperspace, while the big blue ships of Earth smashed his discarded empire behind him. In a month he had found his planet and his people. They were almost human in appearance, but shorter. So much the better. He was like them, but just different enough to be a god. He brought his ship roaring down through the atmosphere, trailing a streamer of flame. As he passed over the sea that covered most of the world, the wash of his jets kicked the water into froth, and the sound of his passage echoed through the sky. The village rested on the shore of the sea. The mud huts trembled as his ship sank down, resting on its jet stream until it settled slowly to the ground. Smiling faintly, Mersu put on his spacesuit, strapping his anti-gravity harness on over it. He flew out of his upper airlock carrying a gun in his hand. He hovered in the air above the village. He pointed the gun into the air and fired. A cone of flame shot toward the sky. He pointed the gun at the sea, and towering curtains of steam rose to hang over the village. Mersu descended and found his people grovelling in the mud. Weeks passed. A stream of men carried the ship's cargo into a great sprawling building that Mersu carved out of a stone cliff with a subatomic cutter. The lintels of the building were sanctified with the blood of virgins. A new class of people arose in the village, the priests of Mersu the Firegod. And as the ship rose up into space again, on its journey back into the normal space where Mersu would wait his year and the centuries would pass for his people, the priests chanted over their altars. He will return. Mersu goes to his kingdom in the sky, but he will return, bearing flame in his hands. Mersu the Firegod, Mersu the immortal bringer of fire, will return. And the centuries passed. Mersu brought his ship out of the sky, tearing the air as he came, the growl of his jets thundering over the mighty city on the sea. The sound echoed back from the carved face of the temple of Mersu and beat against the spreading buildings. The ship settled to earth. Mersu strapped on his anti-grav unit and flashed out into the air above the city. He fired his gun into the sea, and the steam curtain rose once more. He pointed the gun skyward, and the heavens danced with flame. A low, snarling car bearing the sign of Mersu's priesthood drove up to him as he touched the ground. 2 men got out and walked toward him, one of them dressed in the sombre black of the priesthood. Mersu stood waiting, his eyes lighting with triumphant fire. "Who are you?" the priest asked. Mersu stared, the pose broken. "Who am I? Kneel, fool! I am Mersu the Firegod!" The 2 men looked at him speechlessly for a moment, then burst into laughter. "Mersu?" The priest wiped his eyes. The other man's laughter trailed into anger. "Watch your tongue, blasphemer," he said curtly, drawing a gun from his holster. "Mersu," the priest repeated. "You're the fool, stranger. At least the others who've tried to claim his godhood had the sense to disguise themselves to resemble his pictures." "Pictures change, rash priest," Mersu thundered. "I am the fire god. Look on my power." Once more he fired into the sea, and once more the steam pillars rose. "I am the god of fire. I fly in the hands of flame. I walk on the air. I burn the land and the sea. I am Mersu." The priest's face lost its tolerant amusement. His mouth twisted in scorn. "Walk on the air, do you? In a Mark 11 anti-grav belt, yes. Burn sea and land, eh? With a sun gun, certainly. Fly in the hands of flame? If you wish to be picturesque about it, yes, but so does every drunken fool of a spaceman." "I tell you, I am Mersu!" Mersu screamed. "Bow down and worship!" "Silence!" The priest's voice was dangerous. "You will come with us to the temple. There you'll see how we worship imposters." "I'll kill you!" Mersu shouted, raising his gun. The priest motioned with his hand. The man with him blew Mersu's head off. "Blasphemer!" the priest spat disdainfully, his voice filled with disgust. He and his retainer turned back to the car, leaving the body to be carted away later. Every evening at sunset, the priests of Mersu stand over their altars and intone the words, "He will return. Mersu the fire god, Mersu the immortal bringer of fire, will return." And the people of Mersu's world intone in reply, "He will return." Throughout the galaxies of hyperspace, wherever the men of Mersu's world may wander, there are other priests and other races that respond, but the ritual is always the same. He will return. And the city waits. The planet waits, and the other planets about the other stars through all the galaxies of hyperspace wait. They always will. Remember to hit the like button if you're enjoying the stories. Thanks. The Mightiest Man by Patrick Fahy. Narrated by William Skye. They caught up with him in Belgrade. The aliens had gone by then, only a few shining metal huts in the Siberian tundra giving mute evidence that they had been anything other than a nightmare. It had seemed exactly like that, a nightmare in which all of Earth stood helpless, unable to resist or flee, while the obscene shape slithered and flopped over all her green fields and fair cities. and the awakening had not brought the reassurance that it had all been a bad dream. That if it had happened in reality, the people of Earth would have been capable of dealing with the terrible menace. It had been real, and they had been no more capable of resisting the giant intelligences than a child of killing the ogre in his favourite fairy story. It was an ironic parallel because that was what finally saved Earth for its own people. A fairy story. The old fable of the lion and the mouse. When the lion had exhausted his atomic armor and proud science against the invincible and immortal invaders of Earth, for they could not be killed by any means, the mouse attacked and vanquished them. The mouse, the lowest form of life, the fungoids, the air of Earth swarming with millions of their spores, attacked the monstrous bodies, grew and entwined within the grey convolutions that were their brain centres. And as the tiny thread roots probed and tightened, the aliens screamed soundlessly. The intelligences toppled and fell, and at last that few among them who retained sanity gathered their lunatic brethren and fled as they had come. If he had known the effect the fungoids would have on them, he would have told them that too. He had told them everything else when he had been snatched from a busy city street, a random specimen of humanity to be probed and investigated. They had chosen well. For the payment they offered him, he was willing to barter the whole human race. As far as it lay in his power, he did just that. He was not an educated man, though he was intelligent. It was child's play to them to strip his mind bare, but they had to know the intangibles too, the determined will of humanity to survive, the probabilities of the pattern of human behaviour in a situation which humanity had never before faced. He told them all he could, gladly and willingly. He would have descended to any treachery for the vast glittering reward they tempted him with. It wasn't easy for the Yugoslavs to guard him, and anyway, their hearts weren't in the task. His treachery, the ultimate treason, the betrayal of the whole human race, was commonly known. Inevitably, the mob got him and killed 3 policemen in the process. When they had sated their anger a little, and the traitor had lost most of his clothes and the thumb of his right hand, they dragged him to the junction where the Danube meets the Sava and held him under the grey waters with long poles as if he was some poisonous reptile. He lay supinely on the bed of the river and smiled evilly while 100,000 people writhed in neural agony. 24 hours later, the neural plague had spread to Zagreb and into Albania as far as Tirana. When it crossed to Leghorn in Italy, the Balkans held 20 million lunatics and the Danube was an artificial lake 100 miles wide. They had used a clean bomb. So they were able to bring a loudspeaker van to its edge and boom at him to come out. He allowed them to do that for some inscrutable reason, perhaps to demonstrate that his powers were selective. Then it seemed he got tired of the farce and cruel fingers twined themselves into the nerve centres of the President of Italy and the Prime Minister of the Government of United Europe. He made them dance a horribly twisted pas de deux on the banks of the Danube for his perverted amusement. Then he released them, and released the millions of gibbering, twitching idiots that inhabited southern Europe, and he came out of the riverbed in which he had lain for 48 hours. He walked alone through the deserted streets of Belgrade until he came to the United Nations building. There he told a very brave lieutenant that he was willing to stand trial any place in the world they wished. For 3 days nobody came to arrest him. He sat alone with the lieutenant in the peopleless city of Belgrade and waited for his captors. They came then, timidly reassured by his non-violence. While he talked to them pleasantly, the citizens of London and Paris suddenly began to dance jerky and grotesque jigs on the pavements of their cities. In the same moment, the Chief Justice of the Court of the Nations, at a cocktail party in Washington, writhed in the exquisite pain of total muscle cramp, his august features twisted into a mask of abject fear. The trial itself was a legal farce. The prisoner promptly pleaded guilty to the charge of betraying mankind to an alien race, but he didn't allow them to question him. When one lawyer persisted in face of his pleasant refusals, he died suddenly in a cramped ball of screaming agony. The grey-faced Chief Justice inquired whether he wished to be sentenced, and he answered yes, but not to death. They couldn't kill him, he explained. That was part of the reward the aliens had given him. The other part was that he could kill or immobilize anybody in the world, or everybody, from any distance. He sat back and smiled at the stricken courtroom. Then he lost his composure and his mouth twitched. He laughed uproariously and slapped his knees in ecstasy. It was plain that he was fond of a joke. An anonymous lawyer stood up and waited patiently for his merriment to subside. If this was true, he asked, why had not the aliens used this power? Why had they not simply killed off the inhabitants and taken over the vacant planet? The traitor gazed kindly at him, and a court stenographer who had cautiously picked up a pencil returned agonizingly to her fetal position and that way died. The traitor looked at his fingers and shrugged. The thumb that had been snapped off in the mob's frenzy was more than half grown again. They needed slaves, he said simply. And at the end, while some of them were still sane? The traitor raised his eyebrows, giving him his full courteous attention. The lawyer sat down abruptly, his question unfinished. The creature who had betrayed his own race smiled at him and permitted him to live. He even completed his question for him and answered it. Why did they not kill then? They had something else on their minds. Fungoids! He laughed uproariously at his macabre joke. And in their minds, too. The lawyer's blue eyes gazed at him steadily, and he stopped laughing. In the bated hush of the courtroom, he said softly, What a pity I'm not an alien, too. You could have the fungoids destroy me. He laughed again helplessly, the tears running down his cheeks. The Chief Justice adjourned the court then, and the prisoner sauntered to his comfortable quarters in front of his frightened guards. That night, in his own living room, the Chief Justice danced an agonized fandango in front of his horror-stricken wife, and the anonymous lawyer sat in his apartment, staring at the blank wall. He was glad the aliens had not made the traitor telepathic, too. He had found the chink in his armor. The neural paralysis, the murders by remote control, were acts of a conscious will. He had himself admitted that if his mind was destroyed, his powers would be destroyed with it. The aliens had not sought revenge because their minds were totally occupied with saving themselves. The stricken ones had simply lost the power. The knowledge was useless to him. There was no way they could attack his mind without his knowing it. Perhaps they could steal away his consciousness by drugging or bludgeoning, but it would be racial suicide to attempt it. In the split moment of realization, he would kill every human being on Earth. There would be nobody left to operate on his brain to make him a mindless, powerless idiot for the rest of time. For any period of time, he corrected himself, his brain would heal again. It was useless to think about it. There was nothing they could use against his invincibility. The only hope was to attack him unawares, and if that hope was a fraction less than a certainty, it could only mean final and absolute catastrophe. The lawyer looked at his watch. It was 4 a.m. He went into the kitchenette and then shrugged himself into his coat. He walked through the silent streets, past the city hospital where the Chief Justice lay in agony, while the motor impulses from his nerve centers wrenched and twisted his body. He entered the foyer of the luxury hotel where the race betrayer was held prisoner and took the elevator to the 6th floor. 2 sleepy guards jerked erect outside the unlocked door. He put his finger to his lips, enjoining them to silence. Then he entered the room and stood for a moment over the man who was invincible and immortal and human. Human and subject to the involuntary unconsciousness which nature demands from all men. He slept. The eyelids fluttered. The lawyer took the steel meat skewer from his pocket. He thrust it through a half-opened eye and rotated it, methodically reducing the soft brain to formless mush. After that, the trial proceeded normally. The prisoner stared vacantly in front of him, and all his movements had to be directed. But he was alive, and his thumb was full-grown again. It was the lawyer that noticed this and pointed out the implications. The thumb had grown to full size in less than 6 weeks. They must regard that as their maximum period of immunity. They ruminated over it for another 4 days. The question was a tricky one, for malignant immortality was beyond human solution. It was not just a matter of dealing out punishment. The problem now was the protection of the race from sudden annihilation. An insolvable problem, but one that must be solved. They could only do their best. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a special feature. It was decided he should be guillotined once a month as long as he lived. Thanks for listening. Make sure to hit the like button and go check out my Substack, where I post 3 free stories a week, plus bonus content, novelettes and serialized novels for paid subscribers. Link to that is in the description. See you in the next one.